Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talk Crazy to Me. I'm your host, Tanya, and today my guest is Laverne. Hi, Laverne. How are you doing today?
I am excellent. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm so happy that we got a chance to finally connect. I know it's been a little bit of time since we first connected, so I'm glad we finally are doing this. But yeah, I always start off by asking how we met. So do you want to tell everyone where we met? Sort of met?
That's a good question because I think we connected through a Facebook page.
Yes.
On podcasting.
Yep.
And that was a few months ago.
It was a while ago. It was before the new year. So it was in 2024 somewhere. So if you remember any of it, your memory is better than me. But I know we connected on that Facebook group looking for guests. And I really resonated with some of the stuff that you were putting out there. And so I got in contact with you. And yeah, the rest is history. So here we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And the crazy thing is since then, I've actually started my own podcast too.
Oh, that's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What's your podcast called? Plug it.
True Emotion Dad.
Nice.
And I want to tell stories, or I am telling stories of my own journey of healing and trauma and just self-discovery and listening to other people's stories, you know, to show other people there's hope. And I want men especially to understand that mental health is normal. We all experience it, and you're not weak to seek help. You're not weak if you feel your emotions and process them. Mm-hmm. And all things that I learned the hard way, I guess.
Yeah, and it actually it shows strength to reach out for help, right? Like it's a strength, not a weakness. But I think the stigma that exists is that it's a weakness when you need help. So I love that you said that. Yeah, and I completely agree that the stigma exists and is probably even harder for men because the, kind of thing is that, you're strong and you don't have those types of emotions. But the reality is we all have big, strong emotions that we feel, go through, and having somebody talk about it and be brave enough to share their story is what this is all about. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. And yeah, it's, I always thought strength was suppressing my emotions. And I used to be proud of how long it had been since I had cried last.
Right.
And how that I wouldn't cry for anything.
Yeah.
Like literally anything. A good friend of mine died and like a couple of tears fell. And I thought I was so strong.
Right.
Like it's so crazy, but society tells men that that's what strength looks like. And when I eventually sought help, I knew I was messed up, but I waited until I thought I was completely broken.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of people wait for that rock bottom moment to seek help. I think that's not something that's uncommon. But yeah, so let me get into my first signature question with you, Laverne. So what makes you crazy? How do you answer that? How would you answer that? What does it make you think of or go to when you hear that question?
Well, my first thought was, what makes me crazy mad?
Right.
I don't.
Yeah.
What makes me crazy, drives me crazy, is the stigma around mental health.
Yeah.
It's so ridiculous. I suffered for years, or about a year and a half before I sought help. I was suicidal. I was depressed. My anxiety was through the roof. I was hostile. I was experiencing hypervigilance to the point of paranoia.
Right.
And because I was too scared, I was terrified of how I would be perceived.
Yeah.
And so when I got therapy and realized how normal mental health is, that we all experience something, and that I had almost died, or I was, at risk of dying because of stigma around mental health, I realized how ridiculous that was. And so that drives me crazy. And
Yeah.
when, I used to be a first responder, and I worked with 6 men that died from suicide.
Wow.
One of them was a really close friend of mine.
Wow. I'm sorry.
And thank you.
Yeah.
But they're dying because of the stigma around mental health. And it's so ridiculous. And we need to talk about it more, because when people start dying of things that are really ridiculous, society responds. Like the Tide Pod challenge.
Right.
Right? Like, oh my
Yep.
God, can you believe kids are doing this? Like, we have to stop this. Parents, look out for your kids. But nobody's saying that when it comes to suicide.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody's saying we got to stop this. And so, as you can see, I'm passionate about it. It drives me crazy.
And I think it's a loaded question, what drives you crazy or what makes you crazy, but it also brings out a lot of, emotion and raw answers, because what drives us crazy is also individual. But yeah, the stigma and with mental health has been driving me crazy for as long as I can remember, and which is why I got into doing this podcast, because the more you talk to people, the more you realize we all have something in us that drives us crazy, makes us crazy. We can go crazy at sort of any moment, any time. And talking about it and realizing that we all encompass something, these, real emotions, is what makes us human, I think. And so speaking about it and talking more just about, in general, what makes us crazy, but getting into the raw nitty-gritty of it too, I think is so important to end that stigma, because we're talking more about mental health than we probably ever have before, but we're still learning so much about it, and there is still such a stigma with talking about it, being open about it. Like, it's easy to talk about somebody else that's going through it, but it's much harder to dig deep and start talking about our own mental health, and that's what this is all about, So I appreciate the honesty of feeling those deep emotions that we go through. So where else has your journey taken you? You said you were a first responder. Did that move into something else now?
Yeah, so I left. I went off work in 2022, and I was off for a while. I think almost a year, with not doing any work, and then I kind of transitioned into the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
I was working as a peer supporter, and thanks to a lack of funding, that position went away. And so now, and the timing of that position was very fortuitous, and it showed up for me. It came to me. And so now I'm back in a stage where I'm trying to find my way, because my whole adult life was geared towards a career in law enforcement. And now I find myself in the 40s, and I'm like, okay, like, what am I doing? Who is Laverne? Right?
Yeah.
So it's been an interesting time. It's been a lot of learning experiences. Yeah. But I do know that I want to help people in the best way I can.
And I think that having that transition period of, doing something for a while and it either not serving you anymore, or you just know you need to move on from it and move into something else, is also something that I went through and am transitioning still into doing other things, including this podcast, that sort of just makes you feel like you're on the right path. So I think we all go through different periods of times in our lives where we're trying new things, and there's so much growth in that, and there's so much that you can find in yourself, in others, and just trying to figure out, like you said, who we are can look different from where we were, 20 years ago or 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. We all go through changes in times of our lives. And I think searching for that path that we should be on is kind of the journey, right? Like, how do we get there and where are we going?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do.
No, go ahead.
I do find, so when I first started seeing a therapist for real after my mental health crisis, and I realized how ridiculous everything was on stigma, I became quite passionate about talking about it.
Right.
And it took me a while to build up to that. But the first time I ever posted anything mental health on social media, I basically posted my story in, I don't know, maybe 5 paragraphs. And I was within 15 minutes, I received a message from a former coworker who had said, you know, I'm going through a really rough time right now. Things are really hard. I've been off work and I've been staying away from social media. And the first thing, you know, I get back on social media today, the first thing I see is your story. And I started shaking. And because you're writing my story, I'm just not at the same place you are. And since that day, every time I speak at an event, every time I speak up, people come forward and they say, you know what, thank you. It helped me in this way, or it helped me see that I'm not alone. It gives me hope, whatever it might be. So the one thing I know who I am and I'm passionate about is talking about mental health and stigma and trauma and, you know, that whole spectrum, because I know it helps people.
Yeah.
And there's not enough voices in the field, and especially men. There's not a lot of men talking about what they've gone through and how they got through it, and just all the stuff that we just don't want to talk about as society, but yet we all experience.
Right. So I touch upon it a little bit of my idea, but speaking as a man, what do you think causes that stigma? Like, where do you think it stems from that it makes it that difficult for men to share?
There's so many moving parts to that.
Yeah.
For me personally, I never saw emotion from my dad. Ever. Which is ironic because he always said it takes a man to cry. But I never saw my dad cry.
Right.
Ever. In my own personal situation, I had an abusive mother. And so it wasn't safe for me to speak up.
Right.
And especially, I think my generation, men are stoic. Men are quiet, they're strong, and they're silent. And I believe that. It was the strong, silent type.
Right.
And so we grow up thinking that we need to be quiet and not talk about your emotions. And then a lot of times, I think the flip side to that is that women are growing up thinking the same thing, right? And so and you know, just speaking from my own personal experience, the intimate relationships I've been in, the women couldn't handle me telling my truth, right? Which so it's not just a man problem; it's a society problem.
Yeah.
But I have never been in a workplace where another man could say to another man, you know, I'm really struggling.
Right.
Like I'm thinking about, you know, suicidal thoughts have been popping up again, or like I'm just lackadaisical. I can't do anything at home. That's not really an acceptable conversation anywhere in society. And I think it is getting better. It is getting better. You know, I've been in men's groups and there's more men's groups popping up, and you know, there's progress there, but it's just all of our conditioning that we've all experienced. And then collectively, like, I don't know, like I don't watch a lot of movies, but I don't remember ever watching a movie where a man, you know, was vulnerable and broke down and cried or something, right?
Right. Yeah. No, it's in our imagery too. You're right. I think it's funny because a couple things popped up for me when you said what you just said, but the one that popped up for me first was about your saying your father never cried. And I do remember the first time I saw my dad cry. And he was, in a deep depression at the time, but he never showed the emotions of it. And then it was just this one conversation he had had with my grandmother, who had called, not his mom, but my mom's mom, so his mother-in-law. And I wish still to this day, because they're both passed, I could go back in time and hear what she had said to him. But she said something to him that triggered, and he got off the phone and he cried. And I heard him crying, and I came, to him and hugged him and said, what can I do? How can I help you? But it was probably one of the most significant times of my life with him. And one of the most significant memories I have of my dad was that time. He showed true raw emotion and broke down, and it was a turning point for him, for sure. So that brought up, a lot of memories when you said that to me. And then I think just the idea, because the stigma exists for everyone, but I just, from a male perspective, I've always wanted to know what we think the difference is. But I think on the flip side, I think women are seen as overly emotional or too emotional. And then you get the stigma there of how to tone it down so that you're not seen as too crazy because you're showing too much emotion. So I think we live in this world where, men are seen as not having enough and women too much. And the reality is we're all somewhere in between that. And showing emotion and having raw emotion is, I think, what, and those moments where you can share with people, opening up that sort of deeper conversation is what makes things go round, right? It's what makes us tick. It's what helps us grow. And I just think that it's amazing that you want to share that and continue to share that, because you know what it does when it feeds your soul to have someone else reach out to you and say, hey, that helped me when you said that. Hey, that, that fuels something in you that helps others, but also keeps you going, because you know what it means to share and what it means to be vulnerable and allow yourself to open up that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a thought while you're talking. So men, we stifle our emotions because we don't want to show them. And, women are, I guess, stifling their emotions because they don't want to show too much. Mm-hmm. And both of us are making ourselves small just to fit into society.
Yes.
And so I think there's that much bigger issue. But while you were talking about that, I realized that I grew up thinking that women were just, if they showed too much emotion, they were a hot mess or whatever.
Yeah.
But really, that's the beautiful thing, is when you can show that emotion. And I think it was in the last 2 years when I was in law enforcement. So coming through a mental health crisis made me a lot more empathic, a lot more understanding of people. Mm-hmm. And it changed the way that I operated, that I worked, which didn't really fit into the law enforcement model.
Of course, yeah.
Which is unfortunate, because I personally feel that it does. I feel that's where it should be. Mm-hmm. But I was working a night shift, and I had stopped this guy kind of out in the middle of nowhere late at night. And I was talking to him at the side of his vehicle, and he was getting his documents, and I could sense that this guy, something was up. He was just, trying to keep it all together.
Right.
And so I said to him, I said, hey man, just stop for a second and pretend I'm not in uniform. But from one man to another, are you okay? And he started crying because he wasn't okay. Mm-hmm. He didn't have anybody to talk to. And so all I did was just hold space for him.
And ask that question.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then listen to him. And I couldn't relate to what he was going through. He had some really big problems. And, if I would have said, "Oh, it's going to be okay," he would know that it was insincere because I didn't know, right? But I just held that space for him, and he was able to release his emotions. I got some resources for him. I gave him a list of resources of people he could talk to and maybe get help.
Right.
But there are a lot more men like that are just on the brink and they have nowhere to go and they don't know what to do. And, as men and as society, we have to be kinder to each other and more understanding of that we're all going to go through something eventually.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. I think there's so much, again, the stigma with being either born with mental health issues, developing mental health issues, having a moment of, sort of like a breakdown of emotions. I think there's always space for it to happen at some point in your life. And to judge someone for going through it at any point would be silly because you don't know what happens when it's turned on you and, say, death in the family happens and you don't know how to deal with grief or, anything that can come into your life that you're not necessarily prepared for, can turn you on a dime, right? Like there's things that can just happen that create chaos in your life that you weren't prepared for, and emotions will come through that. But if you stuff it and you hide it and you push it down and you suppress it, like you mentioned before, no matter what, that's still coming out somewhere. It's coming out at some point, whatever that looks like for people. Can be aggression or, it can be tears at moments where you're not prepared to sort of cry in public. Or you always hear those stories that things that can just, someone just says something like you said, that man said, you asked that question and that triggered that emotion because maybe no one had asked him that day or no one had made him feel seen or heard. And that created a moment for him or space for him, like you said. So I think we all have a room for mental health issues. And I think people that think they're clear of it are probably the most messed up in some ways because they're not aware of those feelings, right? I remember hearing a counselor tell me once that I was ahead of the game because I was so aware. I didn't feel ahead of the game. I felt very low and in a very dark time in my life. But I remember her making me feel like just because I was aware of my emotions, I was ahead of the game. And that made me feel good, but I didn't understand it at the time. It took me a long time to be like, oh, okay, now I get why she said that. Because then I started to meet so many people who were unaware. But it took me a while to see how that helped me to be aware of it. Because sometimes I almost hated that I was so aware of it. Yeah. And that I was so conscious of it all the time that I just wanted, because I couldn't change it. I couldn't do what I wanted to do with it. So it felt very frustrating for me to be so aware. But now I realize it's a tool to have in your toolbox if you are aware of your emotions and feelings and have more of an understanding of the underlying issues that they might come from. I know you just touched upon it as well of having, a mom who was abusive. I'm sure that had its toll in your life of what that looked like. A mother and child bond can be so beautiful, but can also be so broken. And so when I think of people that have that difficult, relationship, it's one that, can be hard to discuss. But I think knowing that that had an impact on who you became and then who you're working on through it, I think is powerful to know that.
It is. So I started therapy in January 2019.
Okay.
And ever since then, I've been on this healing journey where I'm learning a lot about myself. And I'm still learning every day the impact of not having that connection to my mom, that safe, nurturing connection. I've never had it. And I'm still learning how that's affected me. And recently, thanks to my podcast, I connected with a man who is about like 22 years older than me.
Okay.
And grew up in the same community as me. And he told me that my mom used to beat her babies in church.
Wow.
And this is coming from a organization that is very much corporal punishment. And he said, like, this was much more than that.
Wow.
And so I know that I've never had a connection with my mom.
Right.
And I came to realize later in life that I was the scapegoated child. I would be violently punished for things that I didn't do, and for things that I didn't do that could have been verified through independent people.
Right.
Like the school teacher or whoever. And so I'd be beaten for stuff like that. I'd be beaten for things that my siblings weren't beaten for or punished for. And sometimes I would get the punishment for something they did. And so I've known that for a long time, that was the role I played. And I've always wondered at how far that went back. And so after this man had reconnected with me or connected with me and told me that story, I started wondering how far it went back. And so with the measles making a comeback in throughout North America,
Yep.
I started wondering if I had been vaccinated. And my parents had always said that I had been, or that all of us had been. But I knew that the role I played. And so I called the health service here and to check on my status of vaccination. And they couldn't find anything. So I went into the health clinic and they had, looked up the records. And they requested the original paper records from Edmonton. Well, I've never received a vaccination of any type as a child.
Wow.
My siblings have. And at least 2 or 3 of them have, since confirmed that they had those vaccination records, but there's nothing for me.
Wow.
And I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
Right? And it's another piece of the puzzle that I get to process now. Right? Because it's something that I believed my whole life, and now it's proven not to be true.
Right. And what that carries for you, knowing that you were the only one that didn't receive them, is also, a piece to the puzzle that can be very difficult to process, because you just would wonder why me, or what did I do, or anything as a child that you would feel, why was I being singled out, and I think, and hearing, I guess, from someone who had been in contact with your mom when you were a child and seen and witnessed things that you maybe didn't have a conscious memory of and now know of, is just also wild to kind of put into context, right? Of how do you process those things?
It's hard. It's hard to describe. The timing of it was, I guess appropriate, because I've already made a lot of other realizations over the years. One of which was that I was never going to get the mom that I wanted or deserved. That was never going to happen. And so I have grieved the loss of my mom, even though I've never really had her.
Right.
And she's still alive.
Right.
Hearing that, especially since I'm a father myself now, it's hard.
Yeah.
Even though there's no surprises there, it's still hard to hear because it's just, who does that?
Well, it's hard to imagine because the stigma of a mother is this like wonderful, nurturing, warm, loving character. I even think about how Mother's Day is celebrated, right? Like it's coming up and people just always, put this big emphasis on moms. And I have worked with, been around, and been a part of people's lives who've had a struggling relationship with their mom for various reasons. And I know how difficult that is. And to not personally, because I do kind of have one of the moms that like people should revere. She's an amazing, kind, nurturing woman. But I know on the flip side where I've had relationships with people who have had a difficult relationship with their mom and what that looks like, right? So I think trying to, and knowing that you have whatever capacity, the boundaries that you then put for yourself to make it okay for you to kind of deal with. And I think that that's a journey too that people go on because they want that connection so badly, right? Like there's a piece of just anybody who would want to have a good relationship with their mom, but then there's times where it can't happen, and how that looks for people and how the boundaries then go up. And like you said, to even grieve that loss is kind of can be freeing almost in a sense, right? To allow that, to let go of that piece that you probably have been holding on to for so long, right?
For sure. And I think this plays into the part of how important it is to understand that we all come from somewhere and our past experiences. So for me, Mother's Day is not necessarily a day to be celebrated because it reminds me of my abuser.
Yeah.
And one of the things, but I can't come out and publicly say that because how dare you speak poorly of your mom? Because moms are held in such a high standard, as they should be, at least as the good ones should be. Because, a nurturing mother is extremely important. But one of the things that used to cause me a lot of anxiety, and well, to be fair, everything used to cause me a lot of anxiety. But when I was younger and, I would hear, if you want to see if a man's going to be a good partner, see how he treats his mom. Well, that's way before I understood trauma and anything like that. But me just talking about my mom, I would have a physiological reaction. I would get angry. I would get flushed because my body was remembering all the violence. Yeah. And so I'm like, how do I tell, a girlfriend, that my mom, like, I don't have a good relationship with her. Yeah. Because she's going to just ditch me right away, right? And so I think it's important to understand that we all come from a place of that, or, somewhere. And many times it's not what we're used to. It's not the same as what we're used to.
Right. And and then we all have different stories, and then we all have different journeys, and then we all have different paths that lead us to where we, get to eventually. But I think we have to realize the impact that our childhood has on who we become, and then who we try to kind of figure out to be, sometimes in spite or despite certain things that have happened to us. But I think that the journey is always there based on where you've come from and how far you have to get to, in a sense, if that makes sense. I think having a difficult relationship with either parent can be or both, or sometimes you have none, or whatever your outlook is. I think being able to share that you have a difficult relationship with your mom and why you have it to be, and finding a partner that understands that and not just see it as sort of a red flag of like, because that relationship was not your fault, right? Like you came into a relationship that was treating you poorly. It wasn't the reverse happening. So to get to a point where you find someone that understands that dynamic is not your fault, right? And then how to put it into terms for you to make you feel safe and secure, and knowing that you sharing that is okay, that you knowing that you had a difficult relationship with that significant person in your life was not your fault, and that you can carry it through to try and see how it impacted you, but how it's okay. Like not everybody has this amazing relationship with their mother that is seeming like that stigma exists, right? So I think it's a difficult subject to go through, but I think sharing that again out loud, that not everyone has a great relationship with their mom, is also something that's very powerful to be able to share.
I agree. And I had a very difficult relationship with my dad for many years as well, because he was the enabler.
Right.
And sometimes he would perpetrate, violence or abuse on her behalf. And so I had a lot of anger towards him too.
Right.
But the difference was with him, there were memories from my childhood that proved to me that he loved me. Because there was that softness, that, genuine love that would, surface. He was a very busy man trying to, provide for 9 children.
Right.
Huge family. That's
wow. Yeah.
And I can't even imagine, actually.
Yeah.
And then after a long-term relationship of my own, where, after the relationship ended, I realized, how I had been manipulated and how I had been gaslit and invalidated and all of these things. I realized how easy it was for my dad to be manipulated and controlled. And so that gave me grace for my dad. Even though, logically, it's like, what are you doing? Why did you do that? But having that own understanding of how easy it can happen, and quite frankly, when you've had an abusive parent, you're being conditioned to find an abusive partner.
Yes.
Because that's all you know.
Yeah.
And so I was able to find grace for my dad. And, I've found forgiveness for both of my parents, which has been hard. And sometimes there's lapses in the forgiveness, and I find my anger, which is okay too.
Yeah, of course.
A couple of years ago, I wrote a letter to my dad. I typed it out. And it was about 4.5 pages. There was a lot of stuff in there. And I it took me about 3 or 4 tries to actually read it to him, because I was just so uncomfortable. But I met him for coffee, and I read him this letter telling him how horrible my childhood was. But I started the letter with, I'm coming from a place of love and forgiveness. And I want to tell you this. And he listened to it. He sat there and he listened to me read the whole letter. And the first thing he said when I was finished was, "Thank you. That's all true." And then he told me that he wished he had believed me when I told him I was sexually assaulted when I was 9 years old. And by me doing the healing work and being able to come to him and tell him, and to be quite fair, he had done a lot of work, or he has done a lot of work on himself. It gave him the permission to release something very heavy, because I can't imagine how heavy that would be to carry that around for so many years. He and my mom are still together. So there's boundaries there. I can't say too much.
Right.
Right? Because I understand her behavior very well. But I believe that he was manipulated into not believing me when I told him I was sexually abused.
Right.
And because that is something she always accused me of. She always accused me of lying all the time. Like,
yeah.
I think that's partially why honesty, integrity, accountability are so important to me, is because I didn't see that. But I believe he was manipulated into not believing me. And then after I had been sexually assaulted, and after I had told my dad, I was brought back there.
Wow.
And that is where, in healing work, that second time is what did a lot of damage.
Right.
That first time did a lot of damage. But the abandonment wound, the betrayal, the rejection of that second time is something that it hasn't happened in a couple of years, but if I would perceive a rejection or a betrayal or abandonment, I would feel the same icy cold fear throughout my body, right?
Yeah.
And so I could be angry at my dad.
Yeah.
But I understand how it happened.
Well, I mean, and hearing that, well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And I'm so sorry that you went through it. And I'm so sorry that you weren't believed, because I think they say what's even harder sometimes than the abuse itself is not being believed. So I'm so sorry you had to go through all of that. But I'm sure it gave you some healing to hear him finally say that he's sorry, that he didn't believe you. It doesn't take away from everything, of course, and it's still, I'm sure, a deep, deep wound. But I would, I don't think that a lot of people that aren't believed ever get that.
Yes,
that apology is that I should have believed you. I don't think a lot of people that have been through that type of abuse hear that. So there's some kind of peace or solace that you can take in that. But it's such a very difficult thing to even say out loud. So I'm so proud of you for being able to share that and continue to heal from it, because there's the abuse, any type of abuse, but sexual abuse is just, it's such a difficult journey. I can't speak to it myself personally, not going through it, but again, working with people, being surrounded by people, friends that have been through it, I feel their pain when they talk about it. So I can only imagine what that's like to carry with you for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah. It was a very heavy, dark burden for many years. At some point in my mid-30s, I came to the realization that it wasn't my fault. I hadn't asked for this. There was no control of any kind on my part.
Right.
And I realized that all that shame was not mine to carry. And that shame, well, there's still remnants of it left. And quite frankly, I don't know that it ever goes away. But it made me feel so unworthy. I felt different and broken, and no one would understand what I went through.
Right.
And I didn't get to start addressing that until I started therapy. I was probably, 4, 5, 6 months into therapy, and my psychologist recommended EMDR therapy. And, for those listening who might not understand, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, I think. And so anyway, you reprogram the memories. And we sat down and she asked me what was bothering me, like current day. I told her. She asked me to feel it in my body, and instantly I was taken back to the second time I was sexually assaulted, and to the point where I knew what was going to happen, and the fear I felt throughout my whole body. And so, we did the EMDR session on that. And it took a while. I think it was, probably 45 minutes or whatever. And I was crying the whole time, like just tears gushing.
Yeah.
And at the end of the whole session, she asked me something to the effect of, name something good that came from it. And it almost seems ridiculous to repeat it, but the answer was on the tip of my tongue. And I said, I'm a better dad because of it. And I am a much better dad because of it. I am much more connected to my children and attuned to them than I ever had as a child.
Right.
And I am, there's that whole trauma response of being overly protective, but I try to balance it, but I'm connected with my children. I'm attuned to them. I believe them when they tell me something.
Right.
Right. And so that's very beautiful.
Yeah.
And that adjustment or reframing in my mind has helped me with a lot of things and a lot of healing, because if I can find a silver lining literally from the worst single thing that's ever happened to me, I can find a silver lining on a lot of things.
Yeah.
And the day-to-day stuff, that doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter. And I think sometimes I can come off as almost uncaring, because between that and my career as a first responder, sometimes this stuff that we're worried about that really just, it's irrelevant to our life. Like,
right.
Yeah, we might worry about it, but it's, in the whole scheme of things, it's not a big deal. Right. And when we, like, for me, when I think that, I can think that way, it helps me get through these challenges because they're opportunities for growth or learning.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I think everything in our lives, every experience, it can be seen as a learning experience. And we probably learn from the harder moments in a sense than the joyous ones. So it makes sense that you're taking things that you've been through that were horrific and turning them into something, that you can turn into something that you're learning from what not to do, right? And like a lot of times, I always say parenting is the hardest job. I'm sure. I haven't become a parent yet, but I know that it's got to be the hardest job in the world. But to take what we've been through, I think that the point of what you bring to parenting is take what was good and leave what wasn't, right? And try to reframe, like you said, things that you've been through to not bring forward because it would be easy to say, anyone can bring forward what they've been through and say, oh, well, I've been through it, so, my kids are going to go through it, which is kind of crazy to me to think that way. Or you can say, I've been through it and I'm going to damn be sure to never let my kids go through some of the things that I've been through and change that dynamic and be a better parent because of it, right? Because we learned from what not to do instead of taking what they did and repeating it, right? So how do we reframe it? How do we get away from it? And how do we try to be on the other side of it?
Yeah, and I think most people, and obviously I recognize that's a generalization, but most people just parent like they experienced.
Right.
And I guess I was lucky enough to know that I didn't want to parent the same way.
Right.
And something that I found through my journey of becoming a good parent or trying to be the best parent that I could be and building a connection with my children is I found that I reparented my own inner child. And
That's powerful.
It soothes my inner child to see me giving love and strength and connection and to my children. And I didn't get that.
Right.
And it's especially powerful because my son is a very clear mirror to me. And I think all relationships are a mirror, but he reminds me of myself.
Right.
And he looks like he looks like I did when I was that age. I actually had someone come up to me in a store a couple years ago, and I had this huge bushy beard. It was out of control bushy. And, I have sleeve tattoos, and they didn't recognize me. But they looked at my son, and they said, man, that guy looks like Laverne did. I wonder if that's Laverne. And they came up and they started talking to me. So it's uncanny, but
right.
Parenting him has really helped me parent my inner child and, just show that love and have time for him.
Right. No, I love that. I love hearing that it's parenting your inner child because I don't think I've ever heard that before described that way when you're, to parent your child in a way that you weren't parented. I don't even know if that's a word. Then you are also healing and parenting that inner child that didn't get that love and support that you needed. When you're giving it to your child, it's like giving it back to yourself. I love that. That's a beautiful way of looking at it.
One of the ways that it's helped me actually is I have very high standards for myself, especially when it comes to parenting, because I don't want them to experience what I experienced. Right. And there are times when I will beat myself up a little bit or, be my harshest critic about my parenting. And then I just step back and I talk to myself and I'm like, okay, Laverne, think this through. You just did this or said this to your child. You didn't even get that level as a kid yourself. And you're beating yourself up. Right. Because that was below your standards, but it was still higher than anything you ever experienced as a child.
Right. Right.
And so that helps put it into perspective. And I get emotional sometimes when I think about how I support my children and how I didn't get that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I think still feeling that you can feel that emotion toward yourself, that you didn't get it, but you're still giving it, can be I would imagine a pretty interesting feeling behind that of how that can look. But, you still know that you're doing it for the best of your children, which is all you can really take from it, right? That's all you can really want in life, I would think, is to just be the best version of yourself for them and for that inner child that you talked about that didn't get those things. So I think your story is very powerful in sharing it, and I'm so appreciative of you coming on and sitting here with me and just letting all of this out, because it's just it's stories like yours that will help to end the stigma and change how people see the world. And that's what this is all about. So I'm really, really appreciative of you for coming on here and sharing all this with me, because it can't be, even though you're passionate about it, it can't be easy. I would imagine, to say it out loud every time. I feel that way about certain aspects of my life, that when I share it, it feels great, but there's something that it takes from me to do it. And I'm just very grateful that you came on to share it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having this platform to share it on. It's very important to talk about all these uncomfortable subjects. And you're right, it can get draining at times. And I take time for myself after
Good.
Something like this, right?
Yeah, good. That's good to hear. Yeah, because I think everybody, that shares, it can be a little bit to, take away from some of your energy, but the benefits of it are great. And then, taking a little bit of time for yourself after it can be something really just beneficial for yourself, right? So, I hope that you get the time to do that. And I appreciate all that you've shared. And thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laverne, for joining us today. And thank you all for watching. Hope to see you soon. Bye.